Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from rural Appalachia. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. In the fall of 1903, the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky felt an unusual chill that went deep into the bones of the people who worked the rough mountains. Land for farming. The Marchand family had built their lives around a small cattle farm that had kept them going for almost 20 years in Braith County, where the Cumberland Mountains cast long shadows over lonely homesteads. At the end of a winding dirt road was the farm. There were no neighbors for about 8 miles, and the only way to get there was by a dangerous path that went through thick oak and pine forests. Cyprian Marchand, who was 53 years old, got the land from his father. He had lived on it for most of his adult life, growing the small business into something that could support his wife Serafina and their family. The couple had been together for 28 years. They were happy with their shared work and the rhythm of life in the country, but they had to rely on each other completely because they lived alone in the mountains. Serafina, a 46-year-old woman with gray hair and hands that had been worn down by years of farm work, kept a garden that provided most of their food and served as the local midwife for the scattered families in the surrounding valleys. Families who live in the valleys around here. The Marchand farm had about 160 acres of mixed pasture and woodland. The farmhouse was a simple 2-story building made of local wood and fieldstone that had been quarried from the mountain itself. The property had a big barn built in the traditional Appalachian style, a few outbuildings for storing things and equipment, and a lot of fencing that Cyprian had built and maintained for years with hand-split rails. They had 43 animals in their herd, head of cattle, mostly Holstein dairy cows, and a few beef cattle that made up most of their worldly wealth. The Breathitt County Sheriff's Office kept records of the first incident, which happened on the night of October the 15th, 1903. These records were later moved to the Kentucky State Archives during a reorganization in 1952. Cyprian had done his usual evening rounds, checking on the cattle in their main pasture and making sure the barn was safe from the bad weather that could come from the mountains. Turn mean without warning. The animals looked healthy and settled down for the night, as they always did, in groups near the shelter of the big oak tree that stood in the middle of the pasture. The next morning, when Cyprian came out of the farmhouse to start his daily chores, he found that 3 of his best milk cows had simply disappeared. These cows were not young or adventurous. They were mature and had been part of his herd for more than 5 years. They had never gone beyond the familiar boundaries of their pasture. It was especially strange that the animals were gone because the pasture fence was still standing strong and there were no signs of forced entry or escape. The fence itself was a strong barrier made of oak rails that Cyprian had split and put together himself. The posts were buried deep in the Rocky Mountain soil and had been through years of bad weather and the weight of big animals without showing much wear. The boards were all in good shape, and the earth wasn't disturbed. That could mean that the cows were driven out by force or that they broke through in a panic. It was even stranger that there were no tracks leading away from the pasture at all. The ground was soft because it had rained for 3 days in a row, and any movement of big animals should have left clear signs in the mud. Cyprian spent hours looking for hoof prints, broken plants, or any other sign that might show which way the missing cattle had gone along the fence line and in the area around it. The cows had left. He didn't find anything. Each of the missing animals had a bell around its neck, which Cyprian had put on them years ago after a mountain lion killed a young bull. The bells were big enough to be heard from a long way away, especially in the quiet mountain air where sound traveled for miles. Even if the cows had wandered off in the middle of the night, the farmhouse should have been able to hear them moving. Cyprian and Serafina hadn't heard anything, not normal at night. Cyprian spent the whole day looking for the missing cows in the woods and valleys around him. He called out to them and listened for the sound of their bells. He walked along deer trails and old logging roads, looked in ravines where animals might have fallen, and climbed to high places where he could see the forest canopy for any sign of movement. The mountain forest was quiet, except for the sound of wind rustling through the leaves in the fall and the call of a hawk far away, going around in circles above. The search took him deeper into the mountain than he had been in years, to areas that people rarely go to. There were steep slopes, thick brush, and rocky outcroppings in these areas that would have made it hard for cattle to get around. If the animals had somehow gotten out of their pasture, they wouldn't have chosen such hard ground to roam on. As night fell, Cyprian went back to the farmhouse empty-handed and very upset about what had happened. Gone. Serafina thought that maybe the animals had gone farther than usual and would come back on their own, like cows sometimes did when they were looking for better grazing or were scared of predators. This explanation, while hopeful, didn't take into account the fact that there was no trail and that the missing cows had been the calmest and most predictable animals in their herd. These were mature dairy cows with well-established habits. They had never shown any interest in exploring beyond the limits of the area they know well. The couple decided to wait another day before doing anything else. They hoped that the animals would come back as mysteriously as they had left. While they were waiting, Cyprian noticed that the other cattle were acting strangely. They gathered in the middle of the pasture and stayed away from the places where their missing friends had last been seen. They also seemed to not want to go into the barn for their evening meal, which had never happened before in all of his years of farming. Years of working on a farm. The animals that lived spent most of their time standing still, facing the edge of the forest and being very alert, almost like people. Even though there was a lot of good grass in their pasture, they didn't seem to care about grazing. Their milk production dropped a lot overnight. Serafina, who was in charge of milking the cows every day, noticed that they seemed nervous and distracted during the process. They kept turning their heads towards the treine, as if they were watching for something to come out of the woods. 3 more cows went missing in the same way on the morning of October 18th. There were still no broken fences, no tracks, and no signs of a fight or disturbance. Cyprian's missing animals included 2 of his breeding cows and a young bull that he had planned to sell at market in the spring. The rest of the herd showed even more obvious signs of stress, refusing to graze in some parts of the pasture and making a lot of noise. Not as much milk as usual. Serafina wrote in her journal that the cattle that were still alive seemed to be watching the tree line all the time, as if they were waiting for something to come out of the woods. Their behavior had gotten so strange that she started to worry about their safety, afraid that whatever had taken the missing animals might come back for the rest of the herd. The family would have lost a lot of money if they lost their livestock, but the fact that the animals were disappearing without a trace was just as bad. At this point, Cyprian. He decided to ask his closest neighbor, Mordai Thistleton, for help. His farm was about 8 miles to the southwest along a winding mountain road that was hard to get to, even when the weather was good. Thistleton, a man in his 60s who had lived in the area his whole life and inherited his property from his grandfather, had never heard of anything like this happening in their area. There were a lot of dangers in the mountains, like bears, mountain lions, rattlesnakes, and rough ground. But the planned. He had never seen healthy cows go missing without a trace before. Thistleton agreed to help Cyprian look for the cattle in a bigger area and to tell other families in the area about the missing cattle. The mountain communities were small and cut off from each other, but they had a way to talk to each other that could quickly spread news of strange events or threats. If someone in the area was stealing cows, word of what they were doing would eventually get to the wrong people, and justice would be served quickly. From the people. Thistleton. his 2 adult sons Oadiah and Zephaniah, and Barnabas Whitethorn, a local woodsman who knew the mountain terrain better than anyone else in the county, made up the search party that met on October 19th. Whitethorn had been hunting and trapping in the Cumberland Mountains for 40 years. He could read signs in the woods that other people would miss. He would be able to find any sign of the missing cattle's passage. The group spent 2 whole days, searching the woods and valleys around the marshed property, following deer trails and looking in ravines where cows that were hurt or dead might have fallen. They searched in an organized way, breaking up the land into sections and thoroughly checking each one before moving on to the next. They didn't find anything. There were no bones, no skin, and no proof that the 6 missing animals had ever lived outside of the Martian farm. Whitethorn said something during the search that would later turn out to be important. He said that he had seen strange disturbances in the undergrowth in some parts of the forest, especially along the old logging roads that crossed the mountains from the timber operations of the 1880s. He could easily tell that these were not the usual signs of wildlife passage. Instead, they looked like heavy things being dragged through the woods. The pattern of the drag marks was strange and not very clear. They would show up along a logging road They would go for several yards and then completely disappear on rocky ground, or in areas with a lot of leaves, only to show up again hundreds of yards away with no clear link between the 2 places. At first, Whitethorn thought they were the result of someone hauling wood or tools through the forest, but the pattern was too strange and the marks were too new for normal logging activity. It was even more strange that the drag marks didn't seem to follow any logical path through the woods. They zigzagged in what seemed like random ways, sometimes going back on themselves or into places where the ground was too steep or rocky to travel on. It was like whatever was being dragged was following a plan that had nothing to do with getting things from one place to another quickly. People in the community said that the cattle had been stolen by rustlers, who may have been people from outside the area who knew the mountain roads and had picked the remote area as a target. Marsh End Farm was an easy target. Thistleton remembered seeing strange riders on the old logging road a few weeks before, which helped this theory. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. People who were not from the area sometimes came through on business related to buying and selling timber or speculating on land, so their presence did not seem important. When one of Thistleton's sons finally told the local sheriff, he agreed that cattle rustling was the most likely reason, and said they would look into it. But because he didn't have a lot of money and the place was so far away, it was unlikely that he would be able to do any real research. The sheriff was in charge of a huge area of rough mountain land, and he only had 2 deputies to help him. They were already busy with more important things closer to the county seat. Sheriff Cornelius Blackwater was a political appointee who didn't have much experience with criminal investigations. He was used to dealing with fights between neighbors and the occasional disturbance related to illegal whiskey production. More trouble with illegal whiskey production than with high-tech cattle theft operations. His interview with Cyprian, which took place at the farm a few days after the second disappearance, was short and to the point. Blackwater looked over the barn and pasture and saw that there were no obvious signs of a break-in. They decided that professional rustlers had probably planned the theft of the animals very carefully. The sheriff's official report was filed on October 25, 1903, and can now be found in the Kentucky State Archives. A research project by graduate student Prudence Whitmore in 1963 sums up the events as likely livestock theft by unknown people who used advanced methods and knew a lot about the property. The report points out that there isn't much physical evidence, but it also says that experienced criminals who know how to move around in the mountains could probably pull off such thefts without leaving obvious signs, especially if they knew a lot about the victim's routines and the way the property is set up. Blackwater promised to send more patrols to the area and look into any reports of strange behavior, but Cyprian left the meeting not feeling very hopeful that real help would be on the way. Law enforcement had very few resources in these remote areas, and the crimes were so strange that it was hard to classify or investigate them using standard methods. The sheriff seemed more interested in quickly closing the case than in doing a thorough job. An investigation. Cyprian didn't want to believe the rustling explanation, but it was the only logical one that explained why the animals had completely disappeared. He started making plans to buy new cows in the spring, even though this would be a big financial burden for him, and to make his security better. These changes included adding a night watch during times of high risk, even though the thought of spending cold nights in the mountains sitting, guarding the rest of his herd didn't sound good. Serafina agreed with these plans, but she had doubts about the rustling theory that she wrote about in her journal. Her daily entries from this time show that she was a practical woman trying to make sense of things that don't seem to make sense. In her entry from October 25, 1903, she wrote, "The explanation satisfies the neighbors and the sheriff, but I can't shake the feeling that something else happened here." Rustlers would leave. Some sign of their passage. Some disturbance that even careful criminals could not entirely eliminate. The complete absence of any evidence troubles me more than the loss of the cattle itself. Serafina also noted her concern about the behavior of the remaining animals, which continued to exhibit signs of distress and alertness that seemed abnormal, even for cattle that had witnessed the departure of their companions. There is also the matter of how our surviving animals behave. She wrote, "They still refuse to. Animals have senses that we don't fully understand, and their behavior often serves as a warning of dangers that humans cannot detect. The household attempted to return to its normal routine, though the financial loss represented by the missing cattle created significant hardship for the family. Cyprian was forced to reduce their dairy production and to think about selling some of their remaining animals to pay for their immediate needs. The loss had come at a very bad time because winter was coming, and they needed every cow to make milk during the cold months when other food sources would be scarce. For 3 weeks, life on the Marchand farm went on without any more problems. The remaining cattle slowly started to act more normally, but they still stayed away from certain parts of the pasture, and he stayed more alert than usual. Cyprian had almost convinced himself that the rustling explanation was correct, and that the thieves had moved on to other targets in different parts of the mountains. This calm period came to an end suddenly on the night of November 12, 1903. Cyprian was woken up after midnight by what he later called an unusual sound coming from the barn. It wasn't the usual sounds of cattle or animals moving around in their stalls. The night. Instead, he heard what seemed to be a low, rhythmic scraping or dragging noise accompanied by occasional muffled impacts, as if heavy objects were being moved across the wooden floor of the barn. The sounds were unlike anything Cyprian had heard before in his years of farming. They possessed a deliberate quality that suggested human activity rather than the random movements of restless animals. The rhythm was too regular and purposeful to be the result of cattle shifting position in their stalls or moving about. In response to some disturbance, Cyprian lay in bed listening to these sounds for several minutes, trying to determine their cause. His first thought was that one of the remaining cattle might be ill or injured and thrashing about in its stall. However, the sounds were too organized and systematic to be the random movements of a distressed animal. They seemed to follow a pattern, stopping and starting at regular intervals, as if someone was conducting a methodical search or rearrangement of the barn's contents. After, approximately, the sounds stopped completely after 10 minutes. Cyprian waited a few more minutes, listening to the silence and trying to decide whether to investigate right away or wait until morning. The sudden stop of the noises seemed suspicious, as if whoever or whatever was responsible had suddenly realized they were being overheard. Finally, Cyprian decided he couldn't ignore the disturbance. He quickly got dressed and got the shotgun he kept next to his bed, more for protection against mountain predators than human intruders. As he was getting ready to leave the farmhouse, Serafina woke up and asked what was wrong. Cyprian told her briefly about the noises coming from the barn and his plan to check it out. When he got closer to the barn, carrying a lantern to light his way through the dark, he saw that the building looked normal from the outside. The big doors were still securely latched with the wooden bar that he put up every night, and there were no signs of forced entry or strange activity around the building. The area around it was quiet, except for the normal sounds of a mountain night, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through the trees, and the occasional crack of settling timber. When Cyprian lifted the wooden bar and opened the barn doors, raising his lantern to illuminate the interior, he discovered that 4 more cattle had vanished from their stalls. The missing animals included 2 of his best breeding cows, a young heer that he had planned to keep for expansion of the herd, and a bull that represented a significant investment in the future of his operation. As with the previous disappearances, there was no indication of how the cattle had been removed from the building. The stall doors remained latched from the outside. The hay and feed appeared undisturbed, and there were no signs of struggle or distress. The wooden flooring of the barn showed no unusual marks or damage that might indicate the passage of large animals or the use of equipment to move them. More puzzling still was the fact that the remaining cattle, who should have been upset by any disturbance involving their friends, were standing calmly in their stalls and showed no signs of fear or excitement. They looked like they were in a state that Cyprian could only describe as unnatural calm, as if they had been deliberately sedated or otherwise made docile. When he got closer to their stalls, they turned toward him with expressions that seemed almost expectant, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Cyprian spent the rest of the night looking around the barn and checking every inch of it for clues. He looked for loose boards on the walls that might have been taken off and put back on, looked for hidden panels or trapdoors on the floor, and even climbed into the hayloft to look for any sign of how the animals might have been taken out of the building. He only found one strange thing that hadn't been there during his previous inspections. In the soft earth outside the barn, lit by his lantern, he found a series of strange marks that didn't match any tracks he could find. They weren't cow hoof prints, men's footprints, or paw prints from any forest animal he knew. Instead, they looked like long, shallow furrows in the dirt, as if something had been dragged across the ground with a lot of weight behind it. The furrows went from the barn to the edge of the forest, but they weren't continuous. They would show up clearly in the soft soil for a few feet, then disappear completely when they reached harder ground or areas covered with fallen leaves. The pattern suggested that something heavy had been pulled across the yard, but the intermittent nature of the marks made it impossible to determine exactly what had made them or where they ultimately led. Crean followed the marks as far as he could by lantern light, but they disappeared completely when they reached the rocky ground at the base of the hill that rose behind the barn. He examined the area carefully, looking for any continuation of the trail, but found. It was as if whatever had made the marks had simply ceased to exist once it reached the hillside. When morning came, Cyprian summoned Serafina to examine the evidence he had found. She was deeply disturbed by the mysterious nature of the second disappearance, and particularly troubled by the strange calmness of the remaining animals. The cattle that had witnessed the removal of their companions showed no signs of distress whatsoever, which seemed to contradict everything they knew about animal behavior. Serafina wrote in her journal on November 13th that the surviving cattle show no signs of distress at all, which is maybe the most unnatural thing of all. Animals can sense danger and disturbance in ways that people often don't. They can tell when storms are coming long before we see clouds, feel the presence of predators long before we hear or smell them, and get upset when something threatens their safety. For them to stay so calm after their friends disappeared from the fact that they are very close to the stalls suggests that they either didn't see anything threatening or that they have been affected in some way by whatever force is causing these disappearances. The Marchand family lost a lot of money when they lost their second big group of animals. Winter was coming quickly, and their herd was now less than half the size it used to be. They were worried about losing the farm itself. The animals that lived would not be enough to give them the milk and money they needed to get through. The cold months and the loss of breeding stock meant that it would take years to rebuild the herd, even in the best of circumstances. Cyprian made the hard choice to go to Jackson, the county seat, and formally tell the police about what had happened. He hoped that a more thorough investigation would help find some of the missing animals, or at least give him answers about what had happened. The trip would take most of a day each way over rough mountain roads, but things had gotten bad, enough to make the time and effort worth it. Cyprian decided to search his property one more time in an organized way before leaving for Jackson. This time, he looked closely at places he hadn't looked at closely before. He was especially interested in going to the old mine sites that were scattered around the mountainside behind his farm. Remnants of coal mining operations that were going on in the 1870s and 1880s but were stopped when the seams that were easy to get to ran out. The abandoned mines had a number of horizontal shafts had been drilled into the hillside, and a few vertical shafts went down to depths that were not known. Most of these openings had been closed off or had fallen apart on their own over time, but a few were still open to anyone who was brave enough to go inside. Cyprian had never taken the time to look into them in an organized way, because they were on the steeper parts of his property that weren't good for farming or grazing. There was one important discovery made during the mine exploration. Cyprian found proof that someone had been using the space recently in the biggest of the horizontal shafts. There were footprints on the floor of the tunnel, and there were places where trash had been cleared away to make room for a lot of equipment or materials. Cyprian also found what looked like the remains of makeshift corrals or holding pens made of rough wood and wire, which was even more important. These buildings weren't new, but they were also not old enough to be from the first mining operations. They thought that someone had been using the empty mine as a temporary place to keep animals, maybe as part of a cattle rustling operation that covered a lot of the mountains. The find seemed to back up the sheriff's idea that there are smart rustlers out there. Cyprian was both relieved and angry that he had finally found proof of criminal activity on his property. But as he looked more closely at the makeshift corrals, he saw a lot of things that bothered him when he looked more closely. The building was poorly made and looked like it had been thrown together quickly, which made it seem like it was only meant to be used for a short time. It was even more strange that the holding pens were too small to hold all the cows that had been stolen from his farm. The biggest makeshift corral could hold 6 to 8 animals at most, but over the course of a few weeks, 10 cows went missing from the Marchand farm. If rustlers were using. The mine served as a staging area, so they had to move stolen animals through the building quickly to avoid overcrowding. This showed a level of organization and efficiency that didn't seem to fit with how rough the facilities were. Cyprian also saw that the mine tunnel went much deeper into the mountain than he had thought it would. The shaft had been driven into the hillside horizontally for several hundred feet before branching off into a network of smaller passages that led to darkness, out of reach of his lantern. Some of these passages looked like natural caves that had been added to the mine workings. This made a complicated underground system that could go on for a long time under the mountain. The idea that rustlers could be using this underground network to move stolen cows without being seen made the theft of his animals seem much more likely, if the criminals knew a lot about how the mine worked and the natural. They might be able to move livestock through the mountains without using roads or trails that police might be watching if they had cave systems. With this new proof, Cyprian went to Jackson to meet with Sheriff Blackwater and tell him about the mine workings he had found. The sheriff was much more interested in what he had to say this time than he had been the last time they met. He agreed to set up a more thorough investigation of the abandoned mines and their possible role in the theft of cattle. Robberies. On November 20th, 1903, Sheriff Blackwater started looking into the mine workings. He had a team of 6 men with him, including 2 deputies, a local mining engineer named Zachariah Pendleton, who knew about the old coal operations, and 3 volunteers from the area. The team had ropes, lanterns, and tools to clear paths that might be blocked by falling rocks or other debris. The investigation backed up what Cyprian had seen about recent events in the mines, but it also gave more information that made things more complicated and worrisome. Pendleton's study of the mine workings showed that the original coal extraction operations were much bigger than anyone in the community had thought. The horizontal shafts were connected to a system of tunnels that went deep into the mountain and connected a number of mine entrances that were spread out across the hillside. More importantly, Pendleton found proof that work had been done in the mines much more recently than the 1880s, when the coal operations officially stopped. Some of the tunnels looked like they had been dug up and supported recently, which suggests that someone had been working on and expanding the underground system in the last few years. It looked like this recent work was more about making connections between different parts of the mine network than getting coal or other minerals out. The makeshift corrals that Cyprian found were the most obvious proof of recent work in the mines. A more thorough look showed storage areas for equipment and supplies, workshops where metal tools and wooden structures were made, and sleeping quarters that could hold a lot of people for a long time. The most disturbing thing was finding what looked like a complex communication system that linked different parts of the mine network. The speaking tubes in this system were made of metal pipe that had been put up along the tunnels so that people in different parts of the underground complex could talk to each other without having to walk through the dark passages. Setting up this kind of system would have taken a lot of time, work, and technical know-how. Pendleton's team found that the underground operations were very big and complicated, which made them think that the cattle rustling was part of a much bigger criminal organization that had been active in the area for a long time, putting money into infrastructure. And the amount of planning and resources needed to keep such facilities running showed that a small group of opportunistic thieves would not be able to do it. Sheriff Blackwater widened his search to include other farms in the area looking for reports of missing animals or strange behavior that could be linked to the underground activities. His questions showed that the Marchand farm wasn't the only one that had cows go missing in strange ways in the last few months. A few other families said they had lost pets in ways that were similar to what Cyprian said, but none had lost as many or as often as he did. The way the thefts happened made it seem like the criminals were carrying out a well-planned campaign to steal livestock from farms that were far away from each other in the mountains. It seemed like the choice of targets was based on things like how far away the property was, how big the herd was, and how easy it was for the owners to be scared or retaliated against. People usually stayed away from farms with bigger herds and better defenses in favor of smaller ones like the Marchand place. But as Sheriff Blackwater's investigation went on, he faced more and more resistance from sources he didn't expect. Some of the families he tried to talk to about their missing livestock suddenly didn't want to talk about their losses or help with the official investigation. Some said that their animals had been found or had never been lost in the first place. The first place, even though earlier reports said otherwise. It was even more troubling to find out that some of the community leaders who had first supported the investigation were now telling people not to keep looking into the matter. These people said that the thefts of cattle were part of a bigger economic dispute that involved people from outside the area. They also said that local families would be better off accepting money for their losses instead of pushing for the criminals to be arrested. where this came from. Resistance became clear when Blackwater learned that several well-known business people from Lexington and Louisville had recently bought large amounts of land in the mountains, often through middlemen who bought the land for much less than its real value. People say that these purchases were part of a development project that would bring new businesses and jobs to the area. But the project's details were still unclear, and the promised benefits had not yet come to pass. Blackwater's. The investigation showed that some of the families who had lost livestock had also been approached by people from these businesses who wanted to buy their land. Most of the time, the offers were generous enough to cover the cost of the lost cattle and give the families enough money to move to better areas where they could start over. People who took these offers had to sign contracts that included clauses that said they couldn't talk about their experiences or working with police on investigations. The pattern suggested that the thefts of cattle were part of a planned effort to get small farmers off their land so that outside businesses could buy it at lower prices. The advanced underground operations found in the abandoned mines were likely not connected to cattle rustling at all. Instead, they were probably part of some kind of industrial activity that needed to be kept secret and away from the public eye. This theory got more support. When Blackwater found shipping records that showed a lot of equipment and supplies had been shipped into the mountains by train lines that didn't officially show any cargo traffic to local destinations. The difference suggested that materials were being sent to places that weren't listed in public transportation records, maybe to avoid taxes or government oversight. The industrial theory also explained why there was recent excavation work in the old mines. If businesses from outside the area wanted to start mining or manufacturing there, they would need to look at the current underground infrastructure and make changes to make it work for them. Any business that needed to coordinate activities over a large area would benefit from the mine's communication systems and storage spaces. But this explanation brought up new questions about the exact kinds of industrial activities that were planned for the area, how secretive it is. The project, the threats to local residents, and the advanced infrastructure being built all pointed to something bigger than just mining or manufacturing. The fact that powerful business interests from big cities were involved showed that they expected to make a lot of money from whatever was planned for the remote mountain area. Sheriff Blackwater's efforts to look into the business interests behind the land purchases were met with strong and immediate resistance. Lawful. Representatives from the companies involved threatened to sue the sheriff if he kept getting in the way of legal business activities, and political pressure was put on the sheriff through channels that reached the state capitol. Blackwater's bosses told him to only look into the cattle thefts and not to look into the region's other economic activities. This happened within a few days. Because of these limits, Blackwater had to finish his investigation without answering the bigger questions about the industrial operations or how they might be linked to the missing livestock. His last report, which was dated December 15, 1903, officially blamed the thefts of cattle on organized criminals who ran complex operations to steal livestock and used abandoned mine workings to hide and move the animals. The report said that more police patrols should be sent to the area, but it didn't say anything about the industrial activities or the pressure that was put on. End the investigation. Crean Marchand got a copy of the sheriff's report and was told that the criminal case was being closed because there wasn't enough evidence, and the people who were suspected of the crime had left the area. He was told to file insurance claims for the animals he lost and to make his home safer so that thieves couldn't get in again. No one was arrested for the crimes, and he was not offered any money for his losses. After the official investigation was over, Cyprian and Serafina were still with more questions than answers. The discovery of recent activity in the abandoned mines gave them a good reason for how their cattle had been stolen, but it didn't explain many of the strange things they had seen. There were no tracks. The surviving animals acted strangely, and the disappearances were too organized to be normal criminal activity. Serafina's journal entries from this time show how angry she was with the lack of investigation, and her growing suspicion that powerful people were hiding the truth about what happened on their farm on purpose. She wrote in her entry from December 20th, 1903, "The official explanation satisfies those who want to close this matter quickly, but it does not satisfy those of us who lived through these events. There are too many details that do not fit, too many questions that remain unanswered. I suspect that we have become pawns in a larger game whose rules we do not understand, and whose players have resources that are far beyond our ability to challenge." The financial impact of losing their cattle forced the Martian family to make fundamental changes in their way of life. Without enough livestock to make money through milk sales and breeding, they couldn't keep up their standard of living or meet their financial obligations. Cyprian had to look for work outside the farm, taking a job as a laborer for a timber company that was cutting down trees in the more accessible areas of the mountains. Cyprian's decision to look for work outside the family was especially hard for him because he had never worked for anyone else since inheriting the farm from his father. He was giving up the independence and self-sufficiency that had been a part of his family's life for generations because of economic necessity that he couldn't control. The loss was more than just financial hardship. It was a fundamental change in his identity and his relationship to the land that had supported his family. Serafina tried to keep their household running and continue farming on a smaller scale with the few remaining cattle, but the work was too much for one person, and the money they made wasn't worth the effort. She started to think that they might have to give up the farm completely, which made her sad and angry because it wasn't fair that they had to go through this. During the winter months of 1903 and 1904, the Martian family slowly came to terms with the fact that their farming. The missing cattle represented years of careful breeding and selection that could not be quickly or easily replaced. Even if they had the money to buy new animals, they would not be able to rebuild the herd for many years. The decision to leave the farm was not made suddenly, but rather evolved gradually as the reality of their situation became clear. Cyprian's employment with the timber company provided enough income to meet their immediate needs, but it would not be sufficient to finance the restoration of their livestock operation. The prospects for economic recovery seemed dim, especially given the ongoing uncertainty about the industrial activities that were apparently planned for the region. In the spring of 1904, Cyprian and Serafina received an unexpected visit from a representative of one of the business interests that had been acquiring land in the area. The visitor, who identified himself as, "The company made enough money to meet their immediate needs, but not enough to pay for the repairs to their livestock operation. The chances of the economy recovering looked slim, especially since there was still uncertainty about the industrial activities that were apparently planned for the area." In the spring of 1904, Cyprian and Serafina got an unexpected visit from a representative of one of the business interests that had been buying land in the area. The visitor, who identified himself as Bartholomew Whitfield of the Cumberland Mountain Development Company, offered to buy their property for a price that would let them move and start a new life somewhere else. Whitfield's offer was very generous, much higher than the property's current market value, and included extra money for the livestock that had been lost. The terms of the sale would give the Marchand family enough money to buy a smaller property in a more settled area and start a new farming business, without the isolation and vulnerability that had characterized their mountain existence. However, the sale agreement included the same restrictive clauses that had been required of other families who had sold their properties to the development company. The Marins would be prohibited from discussing their experiences with the cattle disappearances or cooperating with any future investigations into the activities of the development company. They would also be required to relocate outside the immediate mountain region and to stay away from other people who used to live in the area. Cyprian and Serafina both found it hard and painful to accept Whitfield's offer. The farm had been in Cyprian's family for 2 generations, and leaving it felt like giving up their heritage and admitting defeat. But the practical reality of their situation made the offer almost impossible to refuse. They didn't have many other options that would let them recover from their losses and build a secure future. Serafina's last journal entry from the farm, dated May 15, 1904, shows how she felt about their decision. "We are leaving the land that has been our home for so many years, not by choice, but by necessity. The forces that drove us from this place remain mysterious, but their power is undeniable. Perhaps it is better to accept what we cannot change and find peace in a new beginning elsewhere. The mountains will keep their secrets as they always have, and we will carry our memories to whatever new home awaits us." The Marchand family left their mountain farm on May 20, 1904. They only took their personal things and the few cattle that had survived the strange disappearances. They moved to a small town in central Kentucky, where Cyprian got a job as a supervisor for a grain elevator, and Serafina started a small business sewing for local families. The Cumberland Mountain Development Company took over the Marchand property right after the sale was finished, and work started right away on what looked like a big construction project. Heavy machinery was brought into the area over the company's new roads, and crews of workers were brought in from outside the area to do the work. The company kept the details of the project a secret, but people who watched it said that the work seemed to be focused on the hillside where the old coal mines were. New tunnels were dug, and old ones were. The underground facilities were expanded and reinforced, and a lot of metal equipment was put in. The buildings on the surface of the old farm were taken down and turned into industrial yards where materials and equipment were stored. People who lived nearby said that work continued around the clock, with both day and night shifts. The operation was conducted with a level of security that seemed unusual for normal industrial development, with guards at access points and restrictions on public access to roads that passed near the construction sites. The secrecy surrounding the project and the exclusion of local workers from employment opportunities created resentment among some community members. But these concerns were generally outweighed by the economic benefits that the development brought to the region. The influx of outside workers created demand for housing, food, and services that provided new sources of income for local businesses. There were guards at access points and restrictions on public access to roads that passed near the construction sites. The secrecy surrounding the project and the exclusion of local workers from employment opportunities created resentment among some community members. But these concerns were generally outweighed by the economic benefits that the development brought to the region. The influx of outside workers created demand for housing, food, and services that provided new sources of income for local businesses and residents. However, the long-term environmental and social impacts of the development project gradually became apparent as the work progressed. The intensive excavation activities and the installation of heavy machinery in the mountain environment created noise, dust, and vibration that affected the surrounding area. Wildlife populations began to decline, and several families reported problems with their water wells that they attributed to the underground construction activities. More troubling, people who lived near the development sites reported health problems. Some people developed respiratory problems that they had never had before, and some livestock became sick or acted strangely. There wasn't much medical care available in the rural area, and the development company's representatives denied any link between their activities and the reported health problems. The environmental and health concerns led some community members to demand more information about the nature of the development project and its potential impacts on the surrounding area. However, these demands were met with legal challenges from the company's representatives who cited trade secrets and proprietary information as justification for maintaining confidentiality about their operations. The resistance to public disclosure of information about the development project was supported by local and state political leaders who emphasized the economic benefits that the project would bring to These officials said that the need for economic growth in an area that had historically been poor and had few opportunities outweighed concerns about the environment and health. The debate over the development project went on for several years, but it slowly died down as construction was finished and the facility began normal operations. The company's representatives did deliver some of the promised economic benefits, but not all of them, to the extent that was expected. Some local residents worked at the facility, but many of the higher-paying jobs were filled by workers from other areas. The true nature of the operations at the former Marchand farm was never officially revealed, but observers noted that the facility appeared to be involved in some sort of chemical processing or manufacturing activity. Large amounts of raw materials were brought to the site by rail, and finished products were shipped out in containers that were not labeled with their contents. Environmental monitoring of the area around the facility revealed elevated levels of various chemical compounds in soil and water samples. But these findings were not made public and did not result in regulatory action by government agencies. The development company maintained that their operations were conducted in accordance with all applicable laws and regulations, and that any environmental impacts were within acceptable limits. The long term. Consequences of industrial development for the mountain environment and surrounding communities remained unclear for many years after the facility began operations. The secrecy that had characterized the project from its beginning continued to limit public knowledge about its activities and impacts, making it difficult for residents to make informed decisions about their own health and safety. In the winter of 1963, graduate student Prudence Whitmore was conducting research on the social, and Whitmore was working on her master's thesis at the University of Kentucky about the economic history of rural Appalachian communities. While looking through property records and legal documents from the early 1900s at the Kentucky State Archives, she found references to the Marchand farm and the strange disappearances of cattle that had forced the family to leave their land. Whitmore was interested in the case because it was unusual and might be related to her research on how industrial development affects rural communities. She found the remaining official records of Sheriff Blackwater's investigation and Serafina's journal, which a relative had given to the Breathitt County Historical Society years before. The detailed accounts of the strange things that had happened on the farm in Serafina's journal made Whitmore think that the case needed more investigation. The systematic nature of the cattle disappearances, the discovery of sophisticated underground operations, and the involvement of powerful business interests suggested connections to broader patterns of industrial development and land acquisition in the Appalachian region. Whitmore's research showed that the Cumberland Mountain Development Company and its related businesses had bought many properties in the Appalachian region in the early 1900s. The Marchand farm was just one of many. The company bought land all over the mountain region, often under strange circumstances like losing livestock, having equipment break down, or other strange things happening. Problems that forced property owners to sell their holdings. More importantly, Whitmore's research showed that the area around the old Marchand farm had been home to large, secretive industrial operations in the early 1900s that were not accurately recorded in official records. These operations seemed to be focused on getting and processing materials that were very useful for military and industrial purposes in the years leading up to World War I. War I. The industrial activities required the construction of sophisticated underground facilities that extended far beyond the original coal mine workings. These facilities included laboratories, workshops, storage areas, and transportation systems that were designed to support large-scale manufacturing operations while maintaining complete secrecy about the nature of the work being conducted. Whitmore's investigation revealed that the industrial operations were connected to government contracts for the development of advanced military technologies, including chemical weapons and explosives that would later be used during World War I. The remote mountain location provided ideal conditions for conducting dangerous experimental work without risking exposure of civilian populations to hazardous materials or processes. The significance of these discoveries became clear when Whitmore obtained access to a set of classified government documents that had been declassified as part of a routine review process. These documents showed that the former Marchand Farms underground facilities had been designated as a strategic military research installation, and government agencies and private defense contractors had worked together to keep the operations secret. The disappearances of cattle and other strange events that drove families from their homes were part of a planned effort to get rid of civilians in the area who might see or interfere with the secret military research activities. The sophisticated ways that people stole livestock and scared property owners showed how much money and knowledge government agencies and their private contractors had. Whitmore thought that the Marchand cattle's mysterious disappearances were caused by theft by people who worked at the secret military research facility. The animals were probably taken to feed the workers at the underground installation, or they may have been used in experimental research related to the creation of chemical or biological weapons. The strange behavior of the surviving cattle could be explained by their exposure to chemical contamination from the experimental work being done in the underground facilities. The circular formations and periods of alert watching might have been responses to chemical signals or environmental changes that affected the animals' nervous systems and behavior patterns. The deliberate knocking patterns that Cyprian had heard could have been signals used by research to coordinate their activities or to talk to surface operations. The strange patterns seen in the barn hay may have been caused by chemical contamination that changed the way organic materials in the area were structured. To test her theory, Whitmore arranged for environmental testing of the old Marchand property in the summer of 1964. The testing showed that there were higher levels of certain chemical compounds in soil and groundwater samples, including several substances that were known to have been used in military research during the early 1900s. However, when Whitmore tried to publish her findings and get more access to classified documents related to the research facility, she ran into problems with government agencies and university administrators. They told her that her research had touched on matters that were still classified for national security reasons, and that continuing to look into them could lead to legal problems for both her and the university. The pressure to stop her investigation grew when Whitmore found out that her research had caught the eye of people who were not connected to any academic or government institutions. She started getting phone calls and visits from people who said they were representatives of interested parties and strongly suggested that she stop her investigation and destroy any documents she had gathered. These contacts were polite but firm, and they included offers of financial compensation if she would abandon her research and agree not to publish or discuss her findings. When Whitmore refused these offers and attempted to continue her work, she found that her access to research materials was increasingly restricted and that university resources were no longer available for her project. In her final report on the case, dated December 1964, and filed with the university archives under restricted access conditions that remain in effect today, Whitmore concluded that the Marchand family and other rural residents had been the victims of a systematic campaign of displacement conducted by government agencies and defense contractors. The campaign was designed to clear the area for secret military research activities that required complete isolation from civilian observation. Whitmore's report documented the methods used to drive families from their land, including the theft of livestock, the intimidation of property owners, and the use of legal and economic pressure to force the sale of properties at prices lower than the market rate. She found links between the local land acquisition campaign and larger patterns of government and business working together to create military technologies. However, there were also parts of Whitmore's final report that troubled her and that she had trouble explaining within the framework of her government conspiracy theory. Her environmental testing had shown chemical contamination patterns that didn't seem to fit with what she knew about military research activities from the early 1900s. Some of the compounds she found were not known to have been made until much later, which means that research at the site must have continued for decades after the project officially ended. Even stranger were the reports from people living nearby that strange things were still happening around the old research facility. These reports talked about continued chemical contamination effects, equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained, and changes in the behavior of wildlife populations that suggested that some part of the original research activities might still be going on. In early 1965, the university administration told Whitmore that the military research companies involved in the historical activities had threatened to sue the university if the research continued. This officially ended her investigation. The materials she collected were classified and sent to restricted government archives, where they are still mostly inaccessible. The former Marchand farm property remained under. For many years after Whitmore's investigation ended, the land was under the control of the government agencies and their contractors. Private people and groups tried to buy or get to the land, but they were always unsuccessful. Legal restrictions and physical barriers made it impossible for the public to get to the area. In 1969, the property was officially transferred to the Federal Land Management System as part of an environmental conservation program. The transfer was justified as necessary for the protection of sensitive environmental and historical resources. Although the specific nature of these resources was not detailed in public documents, the inclusion of the former research facility site in the federal conservation system effectively ended any possibility of independent investigation of the area or verification of Whitmore's findings. Public access to the land was restricted to designated hiking trails that avoided the areas where the original farm, and current federal land management documents say that the area has hazardous environmental conditions that need to be monitored and fixed all the time. These conditions are the result of past industrial activities that left behind contamination that needs to be managed for a long time to protect public health and environmental quality. Rangers and maintenance workers who work in the area say that the environmental hazards still affect both equipment and people, which means that special safety procedures and limiting the duration of work assignments. Electronic equipment frequently malfunctions in certain areas of the preserve, and both humans and animals show signs of physiological stress when exposed to environmental conditions near the former research sites. These ongoing effects suggest that whatever research activities were conducted at the former Marchand farm may have created environmental contamination that persists decades after the official end of the project. The nature and extent of this contamination is still classified, but its continued presence suggests that the original research may have involved materials or processes that were more dangerous and persistent than conventional military technologies. Recent research conducted by environmental scientists studying federal conservation lands has shown that the soil composition in the former farm area is very different from that found elsewhere in the region. Samples taken from the area show unusual mineral concentrations and chemical signatures that don't match the geological features of the area around them. Even stranger is the fact that biological activity in the area follows very strange patterns. Some plants grow much faster than normal, while others don't grow at all. The number of animals in the area is much lower than in comparable forest environments, and the few animals that do live there show changes in their behavior that wildlife biologists find hard to explain. Right now, most scientists agree that these strange things are happening because of long-term environmental contamination from military research that happened a long time ago. But repeated tests have not been able to find specific contaminants that could explain the range and persistence of the observed effects. Dr. Silas Goodman, an environmental chemist who has studied the area a lot, has suggested that the strange things might be caused by experimental research that used materials or processes that were not well understood at the time. His theory is that early military researchers may have accidentally created conditions in the environment that continue to affect biological systems in ways that current science cannot fully explain. Goodman's research has found several places where the ground seems to be slowly sinking, creating small depressions and changes in the surface topography that suggest continued movement of materials beneath the surface. His measurements show that these patterns of subsidence are slowly spreading out from the original research facility location and affecting a larger and larger area of the surrounding forest. Goodman's findings are concerning for a number of reasons. If the subsidence keeps spreading at its current rate, it could eventually threaten areas that are currently considered stable and safe for public access. More concerning is the possibility that the underground movements are still messing up the systems or processes that make the area unique, which could make the problems worse instead of letting them go away on their own over time. The Martian farm case is one of the best documented examples of how government secrecy, industrial growth, and environmental effects have interacted in some parts of Appalachia for more than a century. Historical research has cleared up a lot of the mystery surrounding the original events, but there are still big questions about the long-term effects of whatever processes were set in motion during the secret military research period. The experience of the Marsh family shows how ordinary people can get caught up in bigger historical forces that they don't understand or can't control. Cyprian and Serafina Marchand had to give up their way of life not because of any action they had taken, but because their land had been selected for purposes that required their removal from the area. Their story demonstrates the human cost of government and corporate activities that prioritize secrecy and strategic objectives over the rights and welfare of local communities. The systematic campaign that drove them from their farm was conducted with a level of sophistication and ruthlessness that reflected the resources and determination of powerful institutions pursuing their own agenda. The Marchand family lost their cattle, which meant they lost their entire way of life. They had to leave the land that had supported their family for generations and move to a new place where they had to start over. The money they got for their property couldn't replace the independence and connection to the land that had defined their identity. Cyprian worked for the grain elevator company until he retired in 1925. Eventually becoming a respected member of his adopted community despite never fully adapting to town life. Serafina's seamstress business prospered, and she became known for the quality of her work and her willingness to help other families who were struggling with economic hardship. However, neither Cyprian nor Serafina ever spoke publicly about their experiences on the mountain farm or the events that had forced them to leave. The legal agreement they had signed with the Cumberland Mountain Development. The company didn't want them to talk about it, but their silence showed that they wanted to put the traumatic experience behind them and focus on building a safe future in their new home. Serafina kept her journal until she died in 1924, but her later entries were mostly about daily life in town and didn't mention the strange things that had happened that made them leave their farm. In one of her last entries, written just weeks before she died, she said, "I have lived long enough to know that some memories are too heavy to carry on, and some questions are better left unasked. The mountains have always kept their secrets, and maybe it's best to leave them that way." Cyprian lived until 1929, and he was active and healthy until a short illness at the end of his life. People who knew him in his later years remembered him as a quiet, thoughtful man who was always willing to help his neighbors with practical problems. But he never owned any kind of livestock again, and people who came to his house noticed that he didn't seem comfortable around animals and stayed away from situations where he had to care for or work with them. We may never know the whole truth about what happened on the remote mountain farm in the fall of 1903. The evidence we have points to a complicated situation with secret research going on in the government. Systematic displacement of rural residents and long-term environmental pollution that still affects the area more than 100 years later. What is certain is that the Marchand family faced forces that changed how they saw the world and made them face facts that went far beyond their rural mountain life. Their experience provides insight into a concealed history of governmental and corporate actions that influenced the evolution of Appalachian communities in manners that were predominantly unfamiliar to the public. The tale of the disappearing cattle is one of many similar stories from rural areas. The United States. Stories about regular people who had to deal with strange situations in places where the normal rules of life didn't seem to work anymore. These stories stay in people's minds and in oral tradition long after the specific details have been lost or hidden. They serve as reminders of the hidden complexities that can be found in seemingly peaceful rural areas. The old Marchand farm is now part of a federally protected wilderness area, where access is carefully controlled and environmental monitoring keeps finding strange things that science can't explain. The mountains that used to ring with the sound of cowbells are now quiet, and their secrets are safe from the law and the passage of time. When hikers go into the area on marked trails, they sometimes have strange experiences, like electronic devices that stop working for no apparent reason, or compass readings that don't match known magnetic variations. Small changes in air pressure or temperature that make people feel uneasy or confused. The Park Service says they know about these reports, but they say they are due to the well-known environmental effects of past industrial activities in the area. The silence that now surrounds the Marchand family's old home may be the best way to remember them and their lost cattle. The pastures where 43 cows used to graze are now back to being forest, and the barn where strange noises used to wake people up at night is now quiet, has long since fallen apart, and the wilderness is slowly taking back what is left of it. The Macabre farm, where cows disappeared overnight, is a testament to the enduring power of institutional secrecy and the limits of individual understanding when faced with forces that operate on a scale beyond ordinary human experience. Even after decades of investigation and the use of modern research methods, important parts of the truth are still hidden, thanks to classification systems and legal rules that might last longer than the memories of the people who were there when the events happened. The mountains of eastern Kentucky still keep their secrets, just like they have for generations of families who learned too late that some places are better left alone. The story of Cyprian and Serafina Marcia reminds us that in some parts of the world, the impossible may be more real than we want to believe, and the cost of knowledge may be higher than we think. Ready to pay. Some stories don't end with a solution. They end with silence. Some mysteries become more complicated over time instead of clearer. Some truths are still hidden under layers of classification and secrecy that make history itself into a new kind of wilderness. Only the most determined and resourceful explorers would dare to go there, and the risks of finding out may be greater than the value of the knowledge that is waiting.